When Colonel Raymond Halbrook stepped off the transport plane at Bien Hoa, he carried three things as if they were sacred: a clipboard, a doctrine, and a chest full of medals that clinked softly whenever he moved. Halbrook wasn't a politician in uniform, and he wasn't some rear echelon theorist who'd only ever fought wars on paper. He was the kind of officer the Pentagon quietly adored. West Point honors, graduate work in operations research, the sort of mind that could translate chaos into graphs and numbers. In Germany, he'd watched tank battalions move like chess pieces. Early in Vietnam, he'd flown observation with the air cav and learned to respect the speed of helicopters, the violence of artillery, the clean certainty of an ordered response. To him, war could be solved. Not easy, not cheap, but solved. If you could measure the right things, control the right levers, and make the machine big enough. His favorite equation was written on the first page of his notebook in careful block letters: E equals M times P. Effectiveness equals means times procedure. Means: men, steel, aircraft, fuel, ammunition. Procedure: doctrine, routines, checklists, rehearsals, standard operating plans. Control: always control. From above, Vietnam looked like something you could tame with enough pressure. Rivers like lines on a map, hills that could be labeled, forests that could be assigned a grid. War in the air became geometry, then you landed. On the ground, the country was not geometry. It was a living thing that sweated, rotted, and listened. The jungle didn't behave like terrain. It behaved like a mind. It swallowed sound. It hid movement. It turned good men into coughs and whispers and tired eyes. Still, Halbrook believed the problem was not Vietnam. The problem was methodology. In the spring of 1970, he submitted a request for a short observation tour with Allied reconnaissance elements operating in Phuoc Tuy province. Officially, it was an exchange of tactics. Unofficially, it was Halbrook's attempt to confirm what he'd been saying for months in briefing rooms filled with smoke and confidence. Small team methods were admirable, yes, but not scalable, not reproducible, not reliable. He'd heard the rumors about the Australians and New Zealanders out of Nui Dat, that they worked in teams so small they could vanish into a district and reappear days later without anyone knowing where they'd been, that they carried less than a normal infantryman's lunch, that they avoided helicopters unless they had no other choice, that they moved like ghosts and seemed to care less about firepower than about absence. Halbrook didn't like rumors. Rumors were the enemy of metrics. So he came to Nui Dat with polished boots, pressed fatigues, and a folder of neatly typed orders. He expected a formal welcome, a briefing room, maybe a map table with pins. He expected to observe professionals, yes, but he expected them to look like the modern war he understood. Radios, plans, contingencies, quick reaction forces waiting like insurance policies. What he got was a hangar, a warm canteen cup of tea, and an RAF transport officer who didn't even bother lowering his voice. "They're waiting for you past the tree line," the officer said, as if discussing a maintenance crew. "Just follow the path until it stops, then keep going." Halbrook blinked. "There isn't a briefing." The officer shrugged with the casual cruelty of someone who'd been in the tropics too long. "That's the briefing. No motorcade, no escort, no radio check, no conference table, just trees." Halbrook walked toward the jungle the way a man walks toward an unfamiliar animal, carefully, keeping his posture straight, trying not to show uncertainty. The base behind him was a world of order, sandbags stacked in rectangles, vehicles aligned, antennae reaching upward like logic made physical. Ahead, the tree line was messy. It wasn't a boundary, it was an invitation to be erased, and there they were, 5 men, standing in the shade as if they'd been grown there. Dirty, still, unhurried. Their uniforms were faded and cut in ways that suggested comfort mattered more than regulation. Their faces were smeared with camouflage that looked less like paint and more like someone had asked the jungle itself for advice. One of them wore a boonie hat that had lost its shape. Another had no hat at all and had pushed his sleeves up as if heat were a trivial inconvenience. None of them saluted. They looked at him the way you look at weather, something you notice, accept, and move around. The tallest stepped forward. He was lean in that hard way that didn't come from gyms. He had the eyes of someone who spent more time listening than speaking. "Colonel Halbrook," he said, voice low, dry. "Name's Tirangi, New Zealander," Halbrook realized. Kiwi accent, faint but unmistakable. Halbrook tried to match their calm with his own authority. "Colonel Raymond Halbrook, U.S. Army, here to observe your patrol procedures." Tirangi's mouth moved slightly, almost a smile, almost not. "Right," he said. Then he turned and began walking into the trees. That was it. No welcome speech, no handover, no "this is our mission," no "here's the route," just motion. Halbrook hesitated a fraction of a second, then followed, clipboard in one hand, folder tucked under his arm like a shield. After perhaps 10 minutes, with the base already fading behind leaves, Halbrook couldn't help himself. "Where's your radio operator?" he asked, expecting to see an RTO trailing behind, maybe a second element in support. "Your fire support coordination." Terangi didn't slow down. "You're looking at the whole team, sir." Halbrook glanced around again, certain he'd missed someone. There was no one else, just 5 men and the jungle. And then the first crack formed in his worldview. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a thin line of doubt, because these men weren't moving like amateurs. They weren't improvising. They were quietly certain. They walked in single file, spaced like commas in a sentence. No one stayed in front for long. Point shifted without words, as if the position belonged to the jungle rather than to a man. Their boots barely made sound, and when they did, it was the sound of leaves moving naturally. No metallic clink, no scrape of gear. Their weapons were wrapped, taped, stripped down. One rifle had its sling modified so it didn't slap fabric. Another had a cracked stock that looked repaired with tape and stubbornness. Halbrook, meanwhile, was loud without meaning to be. His boots squelched. His canteen knocked once against his belt. A strap on his pack squeaked in protest every time he ducked under vines. He hated that squeak. By midday, his clean uniform was a memory. Sweat soaked everything. The jungle made its presence known not through danger but through insistence. Heat pressing like a palm, humidity filling lungs, insects finding every edge of skin. The patrol never spoke. Not once. No whispered commands, no halt, no move. Communication happened in the smallest of gestures. A finger lifted, a palm flattened, a tilt of the head. It was language without sound, and it worked with an efficiency that made Halbrook's checklists feel suddenly loud. At one point, he tried to regain a sliver of control. "Do we have a planned rally point?" he asked. "A fallback position if contact occurs?" Silence for a moment, then Terangi flicked his eyes back, not annoyed, something colder than annoyance, not disrespect, just a kind of patient disbelief. "Fallback is for when you're already in trouble, sir," he said softly. "We're trying not to be in trouble." It wasn't bravado, it wasn't a boast, it was a statement of philosophy. Halbrook wrote it down anyway, as if paper could turn it into something he could own. That night, they didn't camp the way Halbrook understood camp. There were no tents, no perimeter lights, no radio check-in. They settled into the bush like animals choosing a place to breathe. Halbrook expected a plan, a rotation, an order. Instead, the jungle decided. One man vanished into a tree line and reappeared where Halbrook least expected him. Another laid down without ceremony, rifle held as naturally as a pillow. Terangi watched the darkness like it owed him money. Halbrook lay on his back, staring upward through a ceiling of leaves. The jungle wasn't silent. It was full of life, chirps, clicks, distant calls. But it was also full of space between those sounds, and in that space, Halbrook felt something he hadn't felt in months. Small, not as an insult, as a fact. On the second day, his clipboard began to die. Moisture curled the edges of paper. Ink smudged where his hand had sweat through it. The first page with E equals M times P blurred until the letters looked less like certainty and more like a memory. He found himself cradling the board like it was fragile, which felt absurd. He had held a wounded sergeant once in a dust-off zone outside Pleiku. He had watched a helicopter burn in a rice paddy. He had seen real fragility, and yet a piece of pressed wood and paper felt like it mattered, maybe because it was the last piece of the world he came from. The Australians, because there were Australians too, Halbrook realized over time, though national lines blurred in the bush, moved without hurry. They didn't rush the jungle, and they didn't fight it. They behaved as if the forest was not something to cross, but something to inhabit, temporarily, like water. Halbrook tried to mimic them. He tried to make himself smaller. He tried to step where they stepped without stepping exactly where they stepped. He tried to breathe in ways that didn't announce him. His body disagreed. A man can command a battalion with his voice. He cannot command his lungs to be quiet when his heart is pounding and the air is thick as soup. At one point, he swatted at a mosquito that landed too long on his neck. Instinctive, thoughtless. Instantly, the patrol stopped. Not dramatically, not with a hand signal that screamed danger. They simply ceased movement, like a sentence cut off mid-word. Terangi turned his head slowly and looked at Halbrook. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even judgment. It was disappointment. Quiet, surgical disappointment. Halbrook felt that look more sharply than any reprimand he'd ever received in a staff meeting. intimidating. No general had ever made him feel as exposed as that one silent stare. He lowered his hands and did not move again until the patrol moved. By afternoon, he noticed things he would have ignored 2 days earlier. Not heroic things, not enemy indicators in the textbook sense. Smaller, the way a patch of grass leaned unnaturally, the way a bird called twice and then stopped, the way the insects shifted tone, like a choir moving into a different key. The jungle had patterns. Halbrook had always believed patterns belonged on paper, but here, the patterns lived in air and sound and smell. On the third day, the jungle went wrong. That was the only way Halbrook could later describe it. Everything had been humming, cicadas, distant wings, the soft, regular noise of life refusing to care about the war. Then, without warning, it's all drained away. Not quiet like peace, quiet like absence, quiet like something walking into a room and everyone else pretending not to exist. The patrol froze. Terangi lifted 2 fingers, then pointed, not forward, not backward, but slightly off to the right, toward a low rise covered in bamboo. Halbrook strained to see. He saw nothing. Then he smelled it. Not strong, not obvious, just a thin thread woven into the damp air. Smoke. Cigarettes maybe, or a small cooking fire. The smell was faint, but in a world where everything smelled like wet earth and rot, it stood out like a color you couldn't ignore. Halbrook's training snapped awake. Contact meant procedure. Procedure meant calling for support. He imagined the chain instantly. Coordinates, artillery brackets, helicopters, blocking forces, firepower shaped into solutions. He reached for his radio out of habit, fingers finding the familiar shape in his pack. Terangi's hand appeared, not grabbing, not aggressive, just present, stopping Halbrook's motion the way you might stop a child from stepping into traffic. Terangi shook his head once. No, instead of moving toward the smell, the patrol drifted, slowly, wide, as if the ground itself were a fragile thing that could crack under pressure. They didn't advance like soldiers about to fight. They moved like men approaching an idea. Minutes later, Halbrook caught glimpses through the green. Shapes, a half-dozen men in dark uniforms near a faint trail, talking, relaxed, a careless laugh. North Vietnamese maybe, or local guerrillas. Halbrook couldn't be sure at that distance, but he could see the casual posture, the way a man stands when he believes no one is watching. Halbrook's pulse hammered. This was the moment Doctrine loved. Fix the enemy, bring the hammer down, convert contact into numbers. But Terangi did not raise his weapon. No one did. They watched, they listened, and then, almost gently, they backed away, leaving the enemy untouched. Halbrook's mind resisted it like a gear grinding. Why not engage? Why not report? Why not turn this into an advantage? When they were safely beyond the smell and the silence returned to normal, Terangi spoke for the first time in hours. "They're not looking for us," he murmured. "No reason to teach them they should." Halbrook stared at him. "But they're there." Terangi nodded. "So are we." It was infuriating in its simplicity. Halbrook realized with a kind of slow horror that what he just witnessed was not caution. It was control, control of a different kind. Not domination of terrain through force, but ownership of the unseen. It left no bodies, no radio logs, no reports, no proof. Just the enemy continuing their day, unaware they'd been measured and dismissed like a threat that didn't deserve oxygen. Later that same day, the jungle held its breath again. Halbrook didn't sense it at first. He only noticed the patrol's rhythm changed, and his body had learned to respect rhythm the way it respected gravity. They stopped. Terangi's head tilted just slightly. Another man's fingers lifted, then curled. An invisible message passed between them. The patrol didn't take positions, it dissolved. One moment Halbrook was surrounded by 5 men. The next he was alone, with only the sensation that he was being watched by allies he could not locate. He crouched low, heart thudding. His mind raced for causes. He heard no footstep, no snap of twig. Then 3 shots. Not a barrage, not a frantic exchange. 3 sharp sounds, spaced as if timed by someone calm enough to count between them. The jungle swallowed the echoes almost immediately. Halbrook held his breath until his lungs burned. Seconds later, the patrol reassembled as quietly as it had vanished. Faces unchanged, breathing steady. No triumph, no commentary. They moved around Halbrook as if nothing worth mentioning had occurred. Halbrook's mouth felt dry. "What?" he began, then stopped, unsure what he was even asking. Terangi glanced at him. "One of them wandered too close," he said. "Could have bumped into us later. Could have bumped into someone else." Halbrook's stomach tightened. "Do we report it?" Terangi looked past him, already scanning the green as if the conversation were a minor inconvenience. "No." No, Halbrook echoed, unable to stop himself. Terangi's voice stayed flat. Reports make noise. Halbrook wanted to argue. His whole career was built on the belief that information was power, that communication was the nervous system of war. But here, noise was not just sound, noise was existence. Halbrook understood then, in a way that didn't require explanation, why these men carried so little, why they spoke even less, why they treated the jungle like a partner and not an obstacle. They weren't fighting a war of attrition, they were fighting a war of presence, and their goal was to remain a rumor. On the fourth morning, the rain held back, light pierced the canopy in pale columns. The world almost looked gentle, almost. Halbrook felt, for the first time in days, that he could breathe without the jungle pressing a hand over his mouth. His boots were ruined, his uniform was stained in ways he could not name. His notebook pages were soft and warped, like leaves. They moved toward higher ground. No one said mission complete. No one needed to. Halbrook had been carrying a question like a stone in his chest since the first hour of this patrol. And now, with the base still far behind and the jungle still indifferent, he finally asked it. "What's the extraction plan?" he said. It was a standard question, a responsible question. In Halbrook's world, every operation had an exit strategy, helicopter coordinates, alternate landing zones, contingencies layered like armor. Terangi didn't stop walking. "We walk out," he said. Halbrook halted in place. "You walk out." Terangi nodded once as if confirming the weather forecast. "No dust off?" Halbrook pressed, the words sounding almost childish. "No pickup zone? No backup if something goes wrong?" Terangi finally turned enough for Halbrook to see his expression clearly. It wasn't smug. It wasn't cruel. It was simply honest. "If something goes wrong," Terangi said, "we stop doing the thing that made it go wrong." Halbrook felt his mind reach for his equation, for E equals M times P, for the comfort of a system that promised outcomes, but the jungle had erased that comfort. These men did not treat rescue as a plan. They treated rescue as a failure you plan to avoid by refusing to be found in the first place. They weren't prepared to be saved. They were prepared to remain unlocated. By afternoon, the tree line thinned and the first hints of base order returned. Distant mechanical hum, the subtle shift in air that came from humans insisting on structure. A vehicle waited at the edge, exactly where it was supposed to be, like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. Halbrook climbed into the back of the truck. Terangi did not. None of them did. They stood for a moment in the scrub, 5 shapes that somehow looked less like soldiers than like part of the landscape. Then, without ceremony, they drifted away in different directions, quietly, casually, until Halbrook couldn't tell where men ended and jungle began. The truck rumbled toward Long Bin, tires spitting red dust. Halbrook sat with his hands on his knees, staring at his own ruined boots as if they belonged to someone else. The base headquarters hit him like a different war. Radios chattering, phones ringing, officers calling for reports. The smell of coffee and diesel and paperwork. Maps were pinned to boards in clean, bright rooms. Arrows drawn in bold confidence. Zones labeled, objectives named. Kill boxes shaded with markers. It all looked so neat. Halbrook found Phuoc Thi on the wall map. It was marked with thin lines and a few typed labels. Low activity, limited contact. He stared at those words until they felt like a joke told by someone who had never left the air-conditioned room. What he'd seen out there wasn't low activity. It was a different layer of reality. A war that did not announce itself with explosions. A war that did not show up in daily briefing slides. A war where 5 men could shift the temperature of an entire district without leaving anything that could be counted. A young lieutenant approached, clipboard in hand, eyes bright with the desire to do things correctly. "Sir," he said, "we'll need your debrief notes." Halbrook looked at the lieutenant's clipboard, clean, straight, intact. Then he looked down at his own notebook, pages warped and stained like something dug up from the forest floor, and he did not answer immediately. That night, in his quarters, Halbrook sat at a desk and opened the after-action report form. The categories were familiar, comforting in their rigidity. Enemy strength encountered, friendly casualties, ammunition expended, fire support requested, lessons learned. His pen hovered above the page. He could fill it out the way the system expected. He could invent numbers that fit into boxes. He could translate ghosts into metrics. Instead, he wrote only in the remarks section, slowly, carefully, as if choosing words that wouldn't break under humidity. Observed Allied recon patrol operating with minimal signature. No reliance on standard support. Communication primarily non-verbal. Movement disciplined beyond doctrine. Engagements avoided unless unavoidable. Their strength is not in firepower but in absence. I witnessed 5 men accomplish more in silence than some units accomplish with noise. lives. They did not seek contact. They did not announce success. They did not require permission to survive. My procedures assume failure and build systems around rescue. Their procedures assume responsibility and build systems around not being found. We train to win by being louder. They win by being less present. He stopped writing, looked down at the first page of his notebook where E equals M times P had once been so clear. The ink had smeared, the letters broken by water stains, and the equation looked tired, like it had marched too far in the wrong environment. Halbrook closed the notebook, set the pen down, and in the quiet between the distant radio chatter and the hum of generators, he spoke to the empty room. Not a declaration, not a confession, just a truth he hadn't known he needed. We keep building bigger machines, he whispered, and they keep learning how to disappear. Outside, the night pressed in, warm and indifferent, and somewhere beyond the wire, in a country that refused to be solved, the jungle kept its own records, not on paper, but in silence.